India's commitment to free speech is under the spotlight, with international monitors saying press freedom is weaker than it was and weaker than it should be. Are they right? I'm the outsider. This is our motion tonight. Free speech is under serious threat in India. Well, speaking for that motion, N. Ram. Until January, he was editor-in-chief of the Hindu newspaper and remains a director of it. And with him, journalist and online interviewer Madhu Trehan, founder of the News Laundry website. Speaking against the motion, Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament for the Congress Party and former Under-Secretary General at the United Nations. And with him, Anil Dhaka, who's worn many different hats, an engineer, film and TV critic, TV producer and newspaper editor, as well as a film censor. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our panel. So could I please ask N. Ram to speak first for the motion?
Thank you. Free speech is under serious threat in India, and it's a growing threat, a widening threat, a steadily escalating threat. Let me enter three qualifications at the start. One, there's no need to exaggerate because there are spaces, considerable spaces for in the system for free speech. No need for the sake of our proposition to believe in the absolutism of the right to free speech, because nobody really does. And third, we can take heart from the spirited defense of free speech from various voices, various quarters, including from time to time the higher courts. But only someone burying his or her head in the sand or losing it in the clouds will deny that the threat is live, present, and serious. The problem, I think, goes back to our Constitution. Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and expression as a fundamental right. This right, hard won in the freedom struggle against a highly repressive British Raj, is unamendable. This is because it's part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court of India. But then free speech is hemmed in, and to a significant extent, I believe, undone by Article 19(2). It provides for restrictions on this fundamental right by law, sometimes reasonable restrictions, some not. Notable among the unreasonable restrictions seemingly allowed by the Constitution are the law of criminal defamation, the undefined power of contempt of court, uncodified legislative privilege, the outrageous law of sedition, that is Section 124(a) of the Indian Penal Code. And Nehru, in a parliamentary debate Jawaharlal Nehru in 1951, said this 124(a) is highly obnoxious, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better.
Can I ask you to come to a close, please?
Yes, today the threat is of a much higher order because there's serious violence and a shocking acquiescence by the state in these indication and acts of intolerance. See what happened to M.F. Hussain. We were the first country to ban the satanic verses and so forth.
All right. N. Ram, thank you very much indeed. You were a newspaper editor for many years, big newspaper, The Hindu. You ever leaned on?
Yes, indeed we were.
And you buckled, did you?
No, we didn't.
You never did? So you managed to practice free speech as an editor in this country?
But there's a chilling effect, a long-term chilling effect.
Not on you, seemingly.
I think you think it's not on you, but there is. It chills under the skin.
What was the chilling effect on you? Did you self-censor after a while?
You thought a bit about what to publish, how to publish, whether you name somebody or not, although I was pretty clear that the law would permit it because the reporter or sometimes I may be summoned to court, and as they say, the lawyers, the process is a punishment.
But in all those years that you were editor of The Hindu, you never buckled once?
I don't think I did.
So you practiced free speech?
Against the odds.
Well, it's always against the odds. Everybody always wants to curtail free speech in any country. Did you not expect a battle?
I'm proud that we went through the battle, but it's not a very liberal environment.
How easy did you think it would be to practice free speech?
Yeah, I didn't want anything easy.
You have enormous power. The newspapers in this country have enormous power. You've got, 100 million copies of various newspapers sold every day, 70,000 newspapers, 500 broadcasting satellite channels. This is incredible raw power. And yet you say you're being kicked around by the government, suppressed, that there's a real danger to you. It doesn't look like it when you turn on the television, does it? What's not being said?
some of the power is being abused, but not by people like us who believe in accountability and social responsibility and professionalism and ethics of the profession, ethics of journalism and ethics of free speech, if you like.
You believe in those things, and you were able to practice those things all those years?
More or less, yes.
So you're not a standard bearer for your side of the argument, you're a standard bearer for free speech, actually being able to flourish in India.
Yes, much better than, we deserve much better than this, having fought a highly repressive British Raj. We really stood for this. This was part of the freedom struggle, and this is what we are promised by the Constitution, which makes some shining promises, and yet in practice today, we are much worse off than, I believe, in law and in practice than we were in 1947.
And Ram, thank you very much indeed. Could I now please ask Shashi Tharoor to speak against the motion?
Well, the motion is apparently that free speech is under serious threat in India. The very fact that we are having this discussion, the fact that we're having this debate in front of an audience of citizens from Mumbai is itself a refutation of this preposterous proposition. But then Mr. Ram makes my case for me before I even need to, because he starts off by laying out 3 caveats that essentially sum up the case for why his proposition doesn't stand up. He says, let's not exaggerate. Of course, there's free speech in India. Well, case proven. He says, let's not have absolutism. But then he goes on to question the fact that what we understand in our constitutional system by free speech is sadly perhaps not what the Western world understands. So whereas in the US, for example, you've got the absolute prohibitions of the First Amendment against any infringement on any kind of speech, all speech is protected. In our country, we do have these restrictions, reasonable and unreasonable. I would also disagree with some of those restrictions, but they're there. And the country has still remained safe and free, despite the existence of these prohibitions. And he says we can take heart from the courts, which is certainly an extremely important example, because he himself cited the intolerance shown to the paintings of M.F. Hussain by a bunch of thugs. Well, M.F. Hussein's right to paint as such was upheld by the Delhi High Court in a landmark judgment that has not been challenged. So we do have the court system. But I will add to those 3 arguments against him, which he's helpfully given us, I'll add other arguments as well. One of the important things we need to take heart from is the practice of our democracy. We are a country which has had lots of laws on the books, including these unreasonable restrictions on free speech, but we are sensible not to apply them in the literal spirit in which they might have been applied by a more malicious government. There are, in theory, in the Constitution, these restrictions, but in practice, Mr. Ram can make the case he wants to against this country's free speech. Ms. Trehan can do the same, and we're fine. We talk about it, we argue it, we discuss it.
Could you come to a close, please?
This is a thriving, lively democracy. Yes, there are too many people in our country who find themselves getting too easily offended, and they try and act on the basis of their prickly sense of intolerance. But we don't have to accept that, and our government certainly doesn't accept it. So I have to say that even if there are individuals or elements of society who may behave like this, India as a whole protects free speech. We all enjoy our freedom of expression, and therefore, in that sense, it's not under serious threat.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much indeed. Unless you're a cartoonist who gets charged with sedition, yeah?
And when you get released within 48 hours.
Why were you charged in the first place?
Because, unfortunately, we have a judicial system.
And he wasn't alone. He's not alone in being the only journalist charged with sedition.
We have a judicial system which entertains the most frivolous cases. There was an actress who was prosecuted for kissing Prince Charles on the cheek. I have a case pending against me for the last 4 years,
and yet
because I put my hand across my heart.
And yet
the fact is I still have the freedom of expression to talk about it.
And yet Reporters Without Borders talks about a series of moves by various branches of the state that have threatened and undermined freedom of information. Both federal and local authorities keep taking repressive decisions.
Well, they may take sometimes stupid decisions, but they can be challenged in the courts, and they are. They can be written about and debated as they are.
You're quite happy with the government's recent curbs on the internet. You wrote Mr. Sibal, the telecoms minister. Mr. Sibal's main concern was not with politics, but with scurrilous material about certain religions that could have incited retaliatory violence. That's what you wrote. So you're leaving it up to the mob to decide what can be discussed and what can't be discussed in India.
In an ideal world, in countries where we're not used to having mobs around, you might feel that you can afford to allow outrageous things to be said about certain faiths and so on.
But
We've
you're
seen in our
allowing them
country
to
as
define
recently-
it. You're allowing them
But
to
we've seen
define
as
the space for
recently as
debate.
this summer, Tim, we've seen how people do unfortunately get inflamed, and the serious threats to law and order, not
And
to
they,
freedom
you
of
don't think they
expression.
get inflamed because you let them get away with it. You pander to the mob,
No,
don't you?
I wouldn't say that. I would ask you to look at exactly how many people are involved, how the sensibilities of literally hundreds of millions of people can be affected and inflamed, and ask yourself what a responsible government should do to preserve law and order. Having said
Perhaps
that,
in the
Mr.
long run, the most responsible thing a government can do is to protect free speech and have the law decide what are the limits of it, rather than a mob who says, I'm going to have a riot if you print this or if you put this film on.
I think
you
those-
get to the stage
those
where
riots
even
are-
films like the Da Vinci Code got banned here.
in some states.
Some states.
The fact is that those
You
who
approve of
riot
that
are
sort of
still
thing?
punished. Of
You
course I
approve of
don't
that sort
approve
of
of it.
thing?
I don't approve of it.
But
I've read and seen
that's
the Da
daily
Vinci
life
Code.
in India, isn't it?
In some parts of India, for some issues, with some sensitive jurisdictions, I'm afraid so. But it doesn't
So
mean
free
I approve
speech
of it.
isn't as alive
I'm
and well as you say
Well,
it
I'm
is
free
in
to
India.
disagree with it and to condemn it, and I have done so.
All right, Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much indeed. Madhu Trehan, would you speak for the motion, please?
This is a wonderful example of the government. The Congress party learned during the emergency that you cannot be ham-handed about suppressing the press. So now this same party does it so cleverly. Did you know that in the IT Act in 2008 was passed without discussion in Parliament, which all the parties agreed, because not only the Congress party, but all the parties do want to control the press. In that act, they have since amended it to also include anyone who causes them annoyance and inconvenience, which pretty much covers everything, which gave them the handle to actually call, for Kapil Sibal to call in Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and they asked for 355 pieces of content to be removed from all those websites. And do you know that out of the 355, 258 were all criticism of the current government. Only 3 were related to pornography. Only 1 was related to national interest. And this was according to the Google Transparency Report. This act was passed when nobody was looking. The press, in fact, was sleeping on this, and they passed it without anyone noticing. Then what happens? They think they can do it again. So a close associate of Rahul Gandhi, Meenakshi Natarajan, then tries to pass a private member bill, which will then regulate the press. And in that, if you cross the lines, you can go to jail for 5 years. You have to pay 5 crores of fine if you cross the line according to their criteria. And also, your news organization can be suspended for 11 months or forever. When the press woke up to that and exposed that bill, they quietly withdrew again. Then what happens? Government-appointed Katju, Markande Katju, Press Council Chairman, then passes a resolution asking the government in the same language, that if the press crosses the line, and this time including the electronic media, that they'll have to pay fines. And
thank you.
Next time, I will tell you more that this government is doing without you knowing it to control, and all these people going to...
All right, Madhu Trehan, I have to stop you here. There are some rules here. Everybody else obeyed them. Everybody else obeyed them. Not in the interest of censorship, but in the interest of fairness.
I obey.
Okay?
I obey.
Okay, thank you very much.
No free speech.
Exactly. The question is not whether governments... The question is not whether...
I got carried away, I apologize.
The question is not whether governments fight dirty, it's whether the press can fight back, isn't it?
Yes, and we are fighting back.
And you do fight back, as you said. The press woke up and did something about the particular issue that you were talking about.
We're not always successful.
You don't expect to be.
No, we do want to
be. You do, yeah, I know. But you expect it to be in a free society. There's going to be a battle of ideas.
Yes.
And the press hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in the past anyway, has it?
That doesn't mean that you can censor us. One doesn't have anything to do with the other.
Question of trust, whether people actually trust the press in this country.
That is for the people to decide.
Look at the scandal over paid content that you've had in recent years.
Absolutely,
with the Press
I agree.
Council saying in recent years corruption in the Indian media has gone way beyond the corruption of individual journalists.
And censorship will not help that.
So which is the biggest threat?
Because people like me will expose that paid news.
The question is, which is the biggest threat to press freedom in this country? Is it the journalists or is it the government?
Of course the government. The journalists, if they're doing anything that is corrupt, other journalists expose it, which has happened.
But they don't
You
always
wouldn't know-
expose it, do they? I mean, individuals are putting paid content, paid by politicians or paid by
How would
commercial
you
interests,
know
into their newspaper.
How would you know about paid news unless we had exposed it?
Well, the press council did, but then it tried to bury half of the report,
It wasn't the press
didn't it?
council. It was a film called Brokering News, sponsored by Public Broadcasting Service, that exposed it in detail.
And in
then
2010, the press council did their own investigation.
the press council
Which
just...
9 out of 24 members of the press council voted to add as an annex instead of include in the main report.
But that does, if that means that...
What was that if not
that means that
self-censorship
all
by the press?
Then that means that everything that is happening in the government, that they're corrupt, which means every single person is corrupt. You're generalizing from a small group of people who have done corrupt things, and I do acknowledge it, and they should be castigated. I'm not going to defend corrupt journalists.
I'm just saying you're talking about the government as the big threat to press freedom.
Absolutely.
And saying maybe the press itself is the big threat.
No, the press has to clean up its act, but censorship...
It's a big act to clean up, isn't
Certainly,
it?
but that does not
There's
mean
a long way
censorship.
down.
That does not mean censorship. One does not have anything to do with the other.
All right. Madhu Trihan, thank you very much indeed. Anil Dhaka, if I could ask you to speak against the motion, please.
Well, you are asking all the questions, but I want to begin by asking you a question, which is that why are we debating this at all? Because freedom of expression is such a given in this country that I find it quite ridiculous that, four grown-up people are sitting here and debating it. And a huge audience is sitting here and listening to us.
Well, some of them are quite respectable, but I'll let you go on.
Thank you.
The only time that freedom of expression was curbed is during the emergency in 1975. But if you remember those times, and some of you might remember those times, I think it was the press which was muzzled. But people talked. And within 2 years, the whole excesses of the emergency, the excesses of the family planning and so on, that spread like wildfire through the country. So that when the elections came around in 1977, Indira Gandhi was defeated very badly. And that was purely due to freedom of expression. Remember, at that time, there was no social media, there was no Twitter, there was nothing. It was just people talking. Since then, drastic changes have happened. We've had social media come in a really big way. Indians, the usage of mobile phones in this country, the pace of increase is higher than China, is the highest in the world. We have the highest number of publications in the world. We have 136 TV news channels, all of which are extremely free. Reference has been made to Kapil Sibal, reference has been made to defamation laws, etc. Now, when Kapil Sibal came up with his ideas, they were debated and shot down by the media in a very, very strong terms. When the defamation law in India is so weak that it is absolutely toothless, unlike many countries in the West. So it may be, as Shashi said, it may be on the books, but it is completely ineffective. I would say that if at all we have too much freedom of the media, that leads to a lot of negativity. It leads to maybe sometimes irresponsible coverage, but it is freedom. And you just have to pick up the newspaper every single morning, see how many exposes
I have to
there are.
ask you to come to a close.
Yes, if you have to hear the news channels any evening and listen to all the exposés happening there. And you know there's freedom of expression.
Okay. All right. Anil Dhaka, I have to stop you there. Thank you very much indeed. No threat, no serious threat to free speech in India. And yet India's ranking in the Global Press Freedom Index just goes into free fall, doesn't it? You're now at 131 out of 179 countries, worse than Liberia, Kyrgyzstan, South Sudan, Albania. Not countries that pride themselves on being the largest democracies in the world, are they?
Well, I would question these findings. So who's looking at this? What are the parameters being used? I would debate that. Because we live in this country, we know how much freedom there is.
Well, you can
I've been
debate
an
it,
editor.
but
I have never had a problem with I was editor of The Independent. I was editor of The Weekly. I've never had a problem.
You can debate it, but the fact is that the number of requests for content removal, particularly of internet service providers, is going up and up. So the government's on a roll. Google's latest transparency report. 49% increase in government demands to remove content from July to December 2011 compared to the previous half year. They're going up and up.
You have to ask what kind of content has to be removed. If the requests come from the government, what kind?
The Bangalore Centre for Internet and Society
we see around the world today the protests against this film made in America. We see the violence it has generated. It is senseless violence, but it is the result of one film. So every government has to deal with problems like this. You can't...
So censor that film? You would have censored that film, would you?
I would certainly have.
Because of the response?
Yes.
So you would have pandered to public demand, or what you perceive to be public demand?
Not
doesn't break any laws, the film, does it?
Not at all. There is something called responsible freedom. Freedom has to have limits. If you get in the world, if you get people making films or writing articles which abuse other people's beliefs and faiths, there's going to be trouble. Why should you encourage abuse?
Isn't the freedom, if freedom means anything at all, the freedom is to upset people as well as please them?
Yes.
Or do you think it's just up to the role of the government to decide what pleases people and what doesn't?
No,
the nanny state. That's what you want, is it?
Let's not be so simplistic. Of course,
it comes down to very simple things.
No, it does not. It does not come down to that at all. It comes from freedoms. Always comes a sense of responsibility, and that is a very, very important thing in any democracy.
All right, Anil Dhaka, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break now. When we come back, a question to the audience. What's the biggest threat to press freedom in India, the government or the journalists themselves? Join us in a moment.